good morning or afternoon or whatever it is by the time you all watch this. So again, I'm obviously not there today. You can watch this at your own time. Use the guided notes to help you. And when you are done, please take the open note Google quiz. So let's get started. Come on. Oh, of course it wouldn't be my life. All right, so where we're picking up with the Cold War. Last class, we had talked about the Korean War using that documentary. Now we're going to jump ahead to the later 1950s and focus on the space race. So you get this competition with satellite technology for these two countries to compete to kind of have different goals to be the first in space. So first, it's going to be the first country to launch a satellite. That will be succeeded first by the Soviet Union. They're going to launch, as you can see right here, they're going to launch Sputnik, which is the world's first satellite. The next competition is going to be the first human in space. The Soviet Union will again win that one. Here you have Yuri Gagarin. We are a month behind them. And so there is this fear in the United States that we are losing the space race, and that this is in part because of public schools, you know, as public schools. And so there is a National Defense Education Act that was passed to address this issue, to bump up the STEM programs of the world so that we could be better in the space race. So when President Kennedy gets elected, he is going to make it his goal to put a man on the moon. So while he does not live to see it, it is in part because of the dedication that he gives to NASA that ultimately, in the funding, that ultimately it comes to fruition. So in 1969, Neil Armstrong helps the United States win this part of the space race. We have the first man to walk on the moon with the space race. Sorry. Now, back to fighting, or lack thereof, or fighting. So this brings us to Vietnam, which is happening simultaneously to the space race. Now remember, with these proxy wars, we don't directly fight the Soviet Union, but we do use other countries to fight through them. And so that brings us to the Vietnam War. Now, the background on the Vietnam War is that it was a colony of France. And then World War II happens and Japan takes it over. So when World War II ends and Japan leaves, the French try to reestablish control, but there is ultimately a revolutionary war of which the French give up. They surrender. Now, the surrender happens, but it is to communists, and the United States can't sit with this because remember, we believe in domino theory. If we allow Vietnam to fall to communism, then surely everyone else around them will. So when the French leave, the Americans come in. And so what ends up happening is first we try to mimic what we had in Korea. We divide it. And so there is a meeting called the Geneva Convention, which separates Vietnam into two parts. You have the North, which is communist, and it's divided this time at the 17th parallel. Remember, Korea was divided at the 38th parallel. So the idea is that, gee, this worked in Korea, let's try it again. Ultimately, what ends up happening is they both establish governments and at the same time aren't quite satisfied with the idea of being separated. And so ultimately what ends up happening is they set up governments and then the North attacks the South so that they can regain and be one united communist Vietnam. Now, all of that background happens actually in the 1950s. It happens under General Dwight D. Eisenhower when he was president. When Kennedy takes over, you get continued American involvement. However, Kennedy wasn't as dedicated to Vietnam as ultimately his successor will be. As you may or may not know, Kennedy was only president for 2 years and 10 months before he is assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Do not let me start next class without giving you the story behind that because it's worth doing in person. When he is assassinated, though, his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, is sworn in as the president, as you can see happening right here. Here's Jackie Kennedy watching the whole thing. And Johnson is much more of what we call a hawk in the Vietnam War, meaning he is much more inclined to use the American military in this conflict. Now, Johnson's problem is that the United States is not officially at war in Vietnam. We are more of an advisory or supervisory role. And so Johnson, and we can discuss this in person, Johnson manipulates, uses, I'm not quite certain what the right terminology is there, but he manipulates an event to use it as an excuse to send American troops in. This is called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Ultimately, what you need to know is that we had American ships in the waters outside of North Vietnam. So here you can see here's North Vietnam, it's communist. So we have these American ships that are allegedly just parked there as a warning. Allegedly, and we'll get to this next class, one of those boats was fired at by the North Vietnamese. That report goes all the way to the president's desk. He takes that incident to Congress and uses that as justification to send American military, of which Congress approves. And so after that, you are going to see the number of troops that Johnson is legally able to send dramatically increase. And so you're going to get, by 1968, just 4 short years later, you're going to get almost 500,000 American troops in Vietnam fighting this conflict. Now, this is not World War II. And so for the Americans, this is an incredibly difficult war to fight. For one, it is difficult to identify the enemy. It's not like World War II, where everybody's wearing the uniforms of the country that they represent, and they fight in these kind of almost organized strategic battles. It is very much a guerrilla war. And so it's very difficult to identify the enemy. And as a consequence, the American troops repeatedly are going to attack, whether they're going to attack innocent civilians. And so this is going to be a big deal. And it's also going to make it very difficult to win this war when you don't know who the enemy is. There's not any, organized military bases that you can immediately go for. And so while we do win lots of battles in Vietnam, it's very difficult to win the war because we just don't know who we're fighting at any given point in time. Now, what's unique about Vietnam to World War II is that the whole thing is televised. In World War II, you have some reporters on the field, but for the most part, those films that we watched where you could see the live footage, those are taken by the military. So obviously there is a lag in which that is shown to the American public. It's very much out of sight, out of mind. That's not the case with Vietnam. You have lots of footage of these atrocities. You've got pictures, you've got film, you've got all of this attention brought to this war in a way that did not exist in wars prior. And it's going to make the country very bitterly divided over this war, about whether or not we should even be there, about whether or not we're handling this appropriately, about whether or not we're winning the war. And so you get American culture kind of divided into 2 camps. You have the hawks, which I mentioned previously, which tends to be government officials or older generations who believe that this war is, one, justified because it's to fight communism, but that also everything that's happened is necessary. War is war. And then on the flip, you've got the doves, and these are typically younger, and like you're going to see a lot of college students, but typically younger, but they are going to protest this war as unjust. They don't think it's justified. They think the way that we're fighting it is wrong. And so this is going to lead to a culture clash in America about whether or not this war is okay. Now, these culture clashes are going to lead to some pretty kind of huge and symbolic images like what you're seeing right here. We've probably all seen this one right here of this protest, but they're not all going to be nice and pretty like this. You're going to see some pretty violent protests, as you can see over here and here, about this war. Ultimately, the most violent of protests is going to be what happened at Kent State. Now, at Kent State's in Ohio, there was a organized protest by college students. And it got to a point where the protest took over the university campus. People couldn't make it into classes or into buildings. And so the university called upon the governor to send assistance. He sends in the National Guard. For unknown reasons, the National Guard opens up fire on the protesters on campus. And 4 unarmed students were killed. This picture is of exactly that. This young person has been shot and they've just been left right there while the friend panics. And this becomes this iconic image of how these protests are being handled, which obviously goes on to make the war more and more unpopular. Now, at the same time, while those protests are helping make this war and the way it's being handled more and more unpopular, you then have the actual war. And so in 1968, North Vietnam launches this surprise attack called the Tet Offensive. And they essentially simultaneously target more than 100 areas in South Vietnam. And while they do lose this offensive, they lose it in a military sense. It's not a loss psychologically, because while they might lose the battles, they do significant damage to the American and South Vietnamese forces. And so it is seen as this political victory or psychological victory, because ultimately the North Vietnamese know that as soon as the Americans are gone, they can win this. And so they just need to make the Americans, very similar to how we handled the American Revolution, we just need to make this war a cost that the Americans can no longer handle. Now, the other big impact of the Tet Offensive is that President Johnson decides he will not run for re-election. The war has kind of taken over his presidency, it's gotten in the way of his agenda, and he's out. And so what ends up happening is, Johnson's a Democrat, the next election, 1968, Richard Nixon will be elected president, and it will be under his presidency that ultimately the Americans are going to try one last big push, but then remove themselves from Vietnam. Now, Nixon's policy is known as Vietnamization, the idea that we would withdraw American troops, but we would replace them with South Vietnamese forces. So the idea was American troops would stay a little bit longer to train new, fresh South Vietnamese troops. And then once that training was done, we would remove ourselves from this equation and let this be a Vietnamese conflict, no longer an American-driven conflict. Ultimately, Vietnamization is a failure. We didn't have the dedication, the training, the numbers. And so the United States is going to linger into Vietnam, not before attempting to use a massive bombing campaign on the North Vietnamese to try to stop it. So what ends up happening is the United States meets with the North Vietnamese, and we agree to withdraw troops if the North Vietnamese would agree to leave South Vietnam alone. Now, we knew, or we had to have known, that the idea that the North would leave the South alone is not a promise you could really rely on. And so when we withdraw, you are going to see, this is one of the last helicopters leaving Vietnam, you are going to see massive numbers of South Vietnamese, especially those who had kind of staked their lives on assisting the Americans, try to make their way to America so that they could kind of claim refugee status or just be safe, because they knew when the North ultimately invaded, they would suffer the repercussions of that. So what you're seeing right here are South Vietnamese trying to get on this last helicopter so they could make it to America. When America leaves, we can look at the impact of the war. So 58,000 Americans die in this war, more than 300,000 are wounded. And what kind of makes things especially hard for these veterans is they come back to an America very unlike coming back from World War II. They weren't greeted like heroes. They weren't thanked. They were often returning to outright hostility or indifference because so many people opposed the war by the end. I think something like 28% of America believed this war was right by the time that we withdraw our troops. So there is a lot of, there's a lack of support for these veterans when they come back.